There comes a point when the person who has always been the healer, the giver, and the understanding one finally steps into their true power. That person is the super empath. Unlike ordinary empaths, super empaths are not just sensitive souls. They are warriors of compassion, individuals who can see through masks, lies, and manipulations. And when an avoidant tries to play games, withdraw, test them with silence, it does not weaken the super empath. Instead, it slowly destroys the very ego of the avoidant, because a super empath has mastered something rare. They know when to give, when to hold back, and most importantly, when to rise above. Their silence is not weakness, it is power. Their distance is not fear, it is strength. And their boundaries are not walls, they are shields. Today, I will reveal the 5 powerful signs that show how a super empath silently dismantles the avoidant's ego without raising their voice, without chasing, and without playing any games. When an avoidant pulls away, they often expect a predictable reaction. They expect the other person to panic, to cling tighter, to plead for reassurance, to chase after them as though the connection will fall apart without their presence. This behavior feeds their ego, giving them a false sense of control. But what they do not anticipate is when the person in front of them is not just an empath, but a super empath. This is where the story changes completely, because unlike most people who get trapped in the cycle of proving their love, a super empath refuses to beg. They understand something fundamental, that love, if it requires begging, is no longer love, it is dependency. And dependency has never been the foundation of a healthy relationship. When a super empath chooses not to beg for love, they are not acting out of pride or arrogance, but out of clarity. They have learned through pain, through countless experiences of giving too much, that begging only diminishes their value and empowers the very behaviors that hurt them. Their silence in that moment is not weakness, it is strength. They are communicating something without words. My presence, my care, and my energy are not enough for you to stay, then I will not force you to see my worth. This realization shifts the balance of power entirely, and the avoidant begins to feel a discomfort they are not used to feeling. Because suddenly the game no longer works. For the avoidant, pulling away is often a way to test control. They may retreat emotionally, go cold, or create distance just to see how much the other person will tolerate. They may wait for the empath to knock on their emotional walls, desperate to break through. But a super empath doesn't knock, chase after closed doors. Instead, they stand in stillness, and in that stillness, the avoidant starts to sense something foreign, the absence of validation. That absence eats away at their ego, because they are used to being the one who is pursued, the one who is in control of closeness and distance. When the super empath refuses to participate in that dynamic, the avoidant is left with nothing but their own silence reflected back at them. This refusal to beg is an act of radical self-respect. It sends a message louder than any argument could. I will not compete for love. I will not prove my worth to someone who cannot see it. And it is precisely this refusal that begins to dismantle the avoidant's ego, because the ego thrives on being fed. It thrives on the idea that someone will always come running back, always forgive, always bend. But when no one bends, when no one runs after them, the ego begins to starve. At first, the avoidant may feel relief, thinking the silence means acceptance. But soon that relief turns into unease, and unease into insecurity. They start to wonder why the super empath has not responded, why they have not begged, why they have not tried to pull them back. That wondering is the beginning of the ego's unraveling, because now the avoidant has to face the possibility that they are not as powerful as they believed, that their withdrawal did not produce the desired reaction, that their absence did not make them indispensable. The super empath understands that begging for love only chains them to a cycle of emotional exhaustion. So instead of pleading, they redirect their energy inward. They pour it into self-reflection, into growth, into creating a life so fulfilling that love becomes a choice, not a lifeline. They realize that love is not about who chases harder, but about who shows up consistently, without manipulation, without games. And in this realization, they quietly free themselves from the grip of the avoidant's ego. The avoidant, on the other hand, begins to feel the slow burn of their own tactics backfiring. Once made them feel strong, now makes them feel invisible. What once gave them control now leaves them powerless. The silence of the super empath is like a mirror, reflecting back their own emotional withdrawal. Only this time, it does not lead to validation, but to emptiness. And for the avoidant whose ego depends on being pursued, this emptiness is devastating. By not begging, super empath not only preserves their dignity, but they also shift the narrative. They prove that true strength is not in holding on to someone who withholds love, but in letting go with grace. They prove that their worth is not measured by how desperately they fight for someone who runs, but by how calmly they stand in their own self-value. This silent refusal to beg becomes a quiet revolution, one that dismantles the avoidance ego piece by piece, because in the end, nothing destroys control more effectively than indifference from someone who could have begged, but chose not to. When the avoidant begins to pull back, they expect the empath to come closer, to try harder, to question, to explain, and to do whatever it takes to hold on to the connection. This is a pattern they have relied on many times because it keeps their sense of power intact. But when they come across a super empath, the dynamic shifts in a way they are not prepared for. Instead of chasing after the emotional withdrawal, instead of flooding the space with endless reassurances and explanations, the super empath simply mirrors the avoidance behavior back to them. They do not do this with resentment, nor do they do it to punish. They do it with quiet composure, as though saying, if you retreat, I will retreat. If you grow silent, I will also be silent. If you distance yourself, I will match your distance. This response unsettles the avoidant because it takes away the familiar reaction they crave and places them face with their own reflection. Someone who has built their identity around control, the idea of being mirrored is terrifying. It strips them of their illusion that they are steering the dynamic. And suddenly they are confronted with the reality that their withdrawal does not create pursuit, it creates space. And in that space, the avoidant is forced to sit with their own silence. The super empath does not fill the void with desperate words, does not soothe the discomfort by overgiving, and does not plead for clarity. They simply allow the void to remain, and in doing so, they expose the emptiness of the avoidance strategy. The reason this mirroring is so powerful is because it is done without malice. The super empath is not engaging in a battle of egos. Are they trying to manipulate in return? They are simply aligning themselves with reality. If the avoidant chooses distance, then distance is what they get. If the avoidant chooses coldness, coldness is what they will feel. And because this response is calm and unforced, it becomes more piercing than anger could ever be. Anger can be dismissed as overaction, but calm silence is undeniable. It reveals strength, balance, and restraint, qualities the avoidant is not used to seeing when they pull away. Over time, the avoidant's ego begins to feel the weight of this mirroring. They might start questioning why the super empath has not chased after them, why their silence has not been interrupted, why the distance has not been bridged by effort from the other side. They start realizing that the game they have always played no longer has the same rules. This unsettles them because the absence of the expected reaction leaves them without direction. Their ego thrives on knowing that withdrawal equals pursuit, that silence equals desperate conversation, that emotional detachment equals someone trying harder. But when those equations no longer hold true, the ego feels weak and exposed. The super empath understands that explaining themselves endlessly is a trap. To explain to someone who has already chosen withdrawal is to waste energy on deaf ears. So instead, they embody silence as a lesson, not to teach the avoidant a lesson in the sense of punishment, but to remind themselves of their worth. They realize that no amount of words can convince someone to value what they do not want to value. Therefore, they let the mirror do the work. The avoidant is left staring at their own coldness, their own silence, their own absence. And slowly, it becomes unbearable. This mirroring also redefines the balance of power in the relationship. The avoidant, who has always believed that they could dictate closeness and distance, now finds themselves confused. They realize that the super empath has no interest in controlling or chasing, and yet they remain unshaken. This unsettles the ego, because control only has meaning when someone else reacts to it. Without reaction, control becomes hollow. What the avoidant once believed to be strength, their ability to withdraw, suddenly feels like weakness. The other person is no longer affected in the way they expected. The beauty of the super empath's mirroring is that it highlights the truth without words. It exposes the imbalance in the dynamic and forces the avoidant to see that their tactics cannot shape another person's worth. The super empath, by holding their ground, shows that they can exist fully in the presence of silence, that they do not crumble when someone withholds affection, and that they will not sacrifice their dignity for temporary closeness. This is not an act of revenge, it's an act of preservation. It is the empath saying with their actions, I will not fight for a connection you are not offering. If you step back, I will honor that by stepping back too. This quiet strength is what begins to dismantle the avoidance ego. Nothing is more threatening to a person who thrives on control than realizing that control no longer works. Nothing is more destabilizing than discovering that their absence does not create chaos but clarity. And nothing shatters the ego more than realizing the person they thought they could manipulate has mastered the art of responding without reaction. In this stillness, avoidant begins to lose the grip they thought was unbreakable, while the super empath silently rises above the game entirely. Boundaries are the quiet power that most people underestimate, but a super empath has learned through experience that without them, they will lose themselves in the process of trying to love someone who resists closeness. When an avoidant pushes, withdraws, or tests limits, so they are often seeking to discover just how much they can get away with, how much the other person will tolerate, and whether they can maintain control by creating uncertainty. Many people fall into this trap, giving more, accepting more disrespect, or sacrificing their own needs in order to hold on. But the super empath does not operate this way. They have grown through fire and heartbreak, and from that growth, they have developed boundaries that are calm, unshakable, and impossible to manipulate. When the avoidant attempts to cross those boundaries, they are met with firmness that is not loud but deeply felt. The super empath does not scream, does not threaten, and does not play games. Instead, they calmly hold the line. They make it clear through their actions that certain behaviors will not be accepted. Disappearing without explanation, inconsistent effort, emotional manipulation, or dismissiveness are not things they will bend for. And the striking part is that they do this without hostility. Their boundaries are not weapons but shields, not designed to punish but to protect their own peace. This is where the avoidance ego begins to shake, because what they thought they could bend, they cannot. What they thought they could control suddenly resists them without resistance. It simply refuses to yield. For the avoidant, this is confusing. They are used to people compromising their own needs for the sake of the connection. They are used to others accepting less than they deserve just to keep the relationship alive. But with a super empath, looks that cycle ends. The super empath does not lower their standards in order to be chosen. They maintain their standards and allow the other person to rise to them, or not at all. Unwavering position quietly dismantles the avoidance ego because it removes the illusion of dominance. Suddenly, the avoidant realizes that their usual tactics, pushing away, creating distance, testing patience, do not make the super empath chase harder. Instead, they make the super empath more resolved in their strength, more protective of their boundaries, and more willing to walk away if those boundaries are not respected. The power of these boundaries lies not only in what they protect, but in what they communicate. Every time the super empath upholds a boundary, they're declaring, my self-respect is greater than my fear of losing you. This message is devastating to the ego of the avoidant because it shows them that the super empath is not dependent on their presence for validation or identity. The avoidant can withdraw, they can test, they can attempt to push past limits. None of it will change the super empath's resolve. And in that unshakable stance, the avoidant sees something they rarely encounter, someone they cannot control. These boundaries are not walls that block connection, but healthy lines that define respect. They ensure that love does not come at the cost of dignity, and closeness does not require self-abandonment. The super empath has learned that giving endlessly only depletes them, while protecting their space allows them to love without losing themselves. This realization gives them the strength to say no when others would say yes, to step back when others would cling, and to protect their heart without hardening it. And this very strength is what chips away at the avoidance ego, because the avoidant thrives on the idea that others will sacrifice themselves just to keep the relationship intact. When they meet someone who refuses to sacrifice their worth, they lose their sense of superiority. The avoidant may try to push harder, attempting to test the limits again. Every failed attempt reminds them of the futility of their efforts. They begin to recognize that what they thought was power, the ability to distance themselves, only works on those who lack boundaries. Super empath, distance does not create desperation. It only strengthens the resolve of someone who knows that begging or bending is not the same as loving. And so the avoidance ego is quietly destroyed, not by confrontation, but by the steady presence of someone who cannot be moved by fear, pressure, or manipulation. What makes this even more powerful is that the super empath's boundaries are not rooted in bitterness. They are not about shutting people out or keeping love away. They are about creating a space where real love can exist, mutual, respectful, and secure. The avoidant is invited into that space, but they are not allowed to damage it. And if they cannot rise to the level of that respect, they lose access to it. This is the unspoken truth that eats away at the avoidant's ego. They are not being rejected out of cruelty, but being held accountable for their inability to meet someone at the level of real intimacy. That accountability is something they rarely face, and it forces them to confront the fact that their behavior has consequences. In the end, the super empath does not need to raise their voice or prove a point. Their boundaries speak for them. Every time they uphold them, the avoidance ego loses ground because what it feeds on compliance, fear, pursuit is denied. All that remains is the reality that they are dealing with someone who cannot be broken. Someone whose love is powerful but never desperate. Someone who knows that true connection is not built on control but on respect. And it is in that realization that the ego of the avoidant begins to crumble, piece by piece, under the silent strength of a super empath who refuses to compromise their worth. The most devastating moment for the avoidance ego is not when the super empath argues, not when they cry, not even when they express disappointment. The deepest blow comes in a moment of stillness, when the super empath quietly decides to walk away without fear. This act is not fueled by anger or revenge. It is not a dramatic outburst or an attempt to make the avoidant feel guilty. It is a calm decision that comes from deep self-respect, a recognition that staying in a cycle of inconsistency only diminishes their worth. And when the super empath walks away in this manner, the avoidance ego begins to crumble under the weight of what it never expected: indifference. The avoidant thrives on the idea that they are the ones who decide when intimacy starts and when it ends. They pull away, believing that they hold the power to dictate the rhythm of closeness and distance. They expect that their withdrawal will create panic, desperation, and a desperate attempt from the other person to close the gap. But when the super empath refuses to play that role, when they simply release the connection and carry themselves with dignity, the avoidant realizes that they do not actually control the ending. The power shifts completely. It's because the one who is willing to walk away without fear always holds the strongest position. This willingness to walk away is not impulsive. It comes after the super empath has given enough chances, after they have observed the same patterns repeat, after they have poured love into the connection and realized that nothing can grow where fear dominates. When they decide to walk away, it is with peace in their heart. They do not need closure from the avoidant because they create closure within themselves. They do not need an apology because they have already forgiven in silence. And they do not need to prove their worth because they know their value does not diminish simply because someone else failed to recognize it. For the avoidant, this moment is deeply unsettling. Looks, they are used to being chased, to being the one who leaves and then returns when it suits them, to being reassured that no matter what, the other person will still be there. When the super empath removes themselves entirely, the avoidant is forced to confront the reality of absence. And unlike the absence they create, this one is permanent because it is rooted in strength. The avoidant begins to feel something they often spend their lives running from: loss. Not just the loss of a person, but the loss of power, the loss of control, loss of an ego supply that they thought was endless. The ego suffers most when it realizes it is no longer needed. When the avoidant sees the super empath walk away and continue to thrive, continue to rise, continue to glow without them, it delivers a silent wound to their pride. They expected that their absence would break the super empath, but instead it becomes the very thing that sets them free. And nothing is more destructive to an ego built on control than witnessing the freedom of someone they thought would always remain bound. The walk away of the super empath is not just about leaving a person, it is about reclaiming their life. They no longer waste energy trying to decode mixed signals, no longer drain themselves waiting for consistency, longer sacrifice their needs for scraps of affection. They take back their time, their energy, and their heart. They pour it into their healing, their purpose, their passions. This transformation is what truly destroys the avoidance ego, because the story no longer revolves around them, the center of gravity shifts, and they are no longer the most important character in the narrative. The super empath steps into the main role of their own life, and the avoidant becomes nothing more than a passing chapter. This quiet exit is far more powerful than confrontation. Arguments can be dismissed, tears can be ignored, pleas can be manipulated, but silence and absence spun into ego supply. They create a void that forces the avoidant to see themselves without distraction. And in that void, their illusions fall apart. They are left with the realization that they pushed away the very person who could have loved them deeply. And now that love will never return in the same form. The strength of the super empath lies in their ability to love fully, but also to let go fully. This duality is what makes them so rare. They are not chained to fear, because they understand that walking away from what harms them is not loss, it is liberation. They trust that love will meet them again in a healthier form, and so they do not cling to what hurts them just to avoid being alone. This fearless detachment is what dismantles the avoidant's ego, because the avoidant depends on others being too afraid to leave. When that fear is absent, their control evaporates. In the end, the quiet walk away is not a punishment, but a declaration. It declares that love is only meaningful when it is mutual. Declares that distance cannot be forced to become closeness. It declares that dignity will always outweigh desperation. And while the avoidant may never admit it, deep down they know that the person who walked away without fear has left an imprint on their soul that no amount of control can erase. The greatest strength of the super empath is not only their ability to endure pain, but their ability to transform it into power. Where most people would be broken by rejection, confusion, and emotional withdrawal, super empath takes that very pain and uses it as fuel to rise higher. This is not an immediate process. It comes through deep self-reflection, nights of solitude, and the decision to no longer allow someone else's fear of love to dictate their worth. What makes the super empath so powerful is that they do not stay in the role of the victim. They refuse to let heartbreak define them. Instead, they use every wound as a stepping stone towards strength, clarity, and growth. And this transformation silently destroys the avoidance ego, because it reveals that what was meant to weaken them has only made them stronger. When an avoidant pulls away, they often imagine that the empath will be stuck, paralyzed by confusion, waiting endlessly for their return. But the super empath does not remain trapped in that cycle. Yes, they may hurt. Yes, they may feel the sting of betrayal and distance, but instead of letting that pain consume them, they let it teach them. They begin to ask different questions. What does this experience reveal about me? What patterns have I tolerated for too long? What lesson is hidden in this suffering? In asking these questions, they begin to shift from helplessness into empowerment. The pain becomes a mirror showing them where they need to heal, where they need to set stronger boundaries, and where they need to step more fully into their own identity. This transformation unsettles the avoidant because it breaks the predictable cycle. Avoidant expects their withdrawal to leave the other person weaker, but instead it becomes the catalyst for strength. They expect their silence to diminish the empath's confidence, but instead becomes the reason the empath learns to value themselves more deeply. They expect rejection to crush, but instead it refines. This reversal destroys the ego because it shows the avoidant that their actions have no real control over the super empath's destiny. What was once a source of power, the ability to hurt, has now been stripped away. The super empath learns to channel their energy into building a life that thrives without external validation. They might pour themselves into their passions, pursue new goals, strengthen their physical health, or deepen their spiritual connection. They redirect the love they once gave freely to someone else into themselves, and the results are undeniable. Slowly, their light begins to shine brighter, their presence becomes stronger, and their confidence becomes unshakable. This glow, born out of transformation, is the very thing that destroys the avoidance ego the most. Because while the avoidant stays stuck in cycles of fear, running from intimacy and hiding behind walls, the super empath rises higher than before. Nothing wounds the ego of an avoidant more than seeing the one they thought they could control thriving without them. They begin to realize that the person who once gave them unconditional love is now giving that love to themselves and perhaps to a world that recognizes it more deeply. They see the super empath turning pain into wisdom, rejection into redirection, and endings into beginnings. And in that realization, they are forced to confront the truth. They never had as much control as they believed. This transformation also creates an inner freedom that no one can take away. The super empath learns that they do not need to fear abandonment because they know how to hold themselves. They do not need to fear rejection because they understand that rejection often means redirection to something better. They do not need to fear distance, looks, because they have built a life that is full, meaningful, and rich regardless of who stays or leaves. This unshakable foundation terrifies the avoidant because their ego feeds on dependency. When dependency no longer exists, their ego has nothing left to hold on to. The super empath's transformation is not loud. They do not announce it to prove a point, nor do they flaunt it for validation. It happens quietly, consistently, and authentically. They simply rise day by day, becoming stronger, more grounded, and more aligned with their true self. Quiet rise is what destroys the avoidance ego the most because it is undeniable. The avoidant cannot argue with growth, cannot manipulate success, cannot diminish self-love. They can only watch as the super empath becomes untouchable. Ultimately, the pain that once threatened to break the super empath becomes the very reason they rise above everything that was meant to hold them down. Their ability to turn wounds into wisdom, rejection into redirection, and endings into empowerment is their greatest gift. And while the avoidant may never admit it out loud, they feel the sting of knowing that their attempts to diminish the super empath have instead created the exact opposite result. What they thought would weaken has become stronger. What they thought would silence has found a louder voice. What they thought would destroy has transformed into rebirth. This is the final and most devastating blow to the avoidance ego, that the very pain they caused has become the reason the super empath now shines beyond their reach. When you look at these 5 signs, one thing becomes very clear. There is nothing louder than the silent strength of a super empath. They don't need to raise their voice. They don't need to chase. They don't need to prove themselves to anyone who refuses to see their worth. That they dismantle the avoidance ego not through anger, but through composure, not through revenge, but through dignity, not through games, but through truth. That the refusal to beg for love is not arrogance, it is self-respect. The quiet mirroring of behavior is not manipulation, it is reflection. The creation of unshakable boundaries is not cruelty, it is protection. The calm ability to walk away without fear is not indifference, it is freedom. The transformation of pain into power is not denial, it is growth. This is why the super empath is so rare and why their strength is often underestimated until it is too late. They are the ones who can love with all their heart, but also protect that heart with unshakable courage. They are the ones who can see through games, walk through fire, and still rise higher. They are the ones who remind us all that true power does not come from control over others, but from mastery over yourself. So if you are listening to this and you have felt the sting of someone withdrawing, if you have carried the weight of unreciprocated love, or if you have been tested by silence and distance, remember, you are not powerless. You are not weak for caring. And you are not broken because someone could not meet you at your depth. You hold within you the same strength of a super empath, the ability to stand tall, to set boundaries, to walk away with dignity, and to rise even stronger from pain. And to those who try to control, who hide behind ego, who think silence and distance are weapons, understand this. The very person you underestimate may be the one who quietly dismantles the illusion you live in, because no ego can survive forever in the presence of authentic strength. Thank you for giving me your time, your energy, and your presence today. May you walk away from this not only with clarity, but with courage. The courage to love deeply, but never lose yourself. The courage to walk away when respect is missing. The courage to transform every wound into wisdom. Until next time, take care of your heart, protect your energy, and never forget your worth. Goodbye and thank you.